policy and Denver Green Code energy proposals. Um, these are a time that we're just going to go through these proposals that can't be heard in the main committee just because of timing reasons. It's optional for all committee members to attend. They don't need to be here, but it's certainly welcome. The agendas, recordings, and minutes are posted to the 2022 Code Adoption website. And this is just a less formal meeting than the Code Committee hearings. The proponents will present and we'll just have an open discussion where we can make modifications and come to a consensus on the next steps. The agenda is in the meeting invite, and as you can see, there are a lot of proposals we're trying to get through today. So appreciate for everyone for joining, and I think we should go ahead and get started, and whoever can join as they come on, welcome their input. So let me screen share. We have a lot of different proponents coming in and out of the meetings as well today. Second. All right, the first one we're going to be looking at is number 100. It's the Denver Green Code Net Zero Energy Path. So this one was really collaboration within the city itself. And the Denver Green Code Net Zero Energy Path is one of the current paths to comply with the Denver Green Code. The 2019 version requires on-site renewables to meet 100% of annual energy consumption. This is only open to all electric buildings, but this proposal provides more flexibility to allow for off-site renewables. So it can be a combination of off-site and on-site renewables. And the goal is to really just give greater flexibility to projects if they feel they can't do everything on-site. There will be a policy document that helps determine if a building or site is eligible to purchase these off-site renewables. So it would go through the code official, the documentation needed to provide that proof. And the off-site requirements, the details are down here. Let me zoom in for all of you. There's two options. The first option for off-site is it allows an owner to own off-site renewables, truly off-site their own property. So if they own off-site renewables elsewhere, they just have to provide proof of ownership. And then this second point down here, 1.2, this allows you to do off-site through like a purchase power agreement. It requires a dedicated customer capacity to fulfill the customer subscription. So this would be through Xcel or through another renewable energy facility. And so this would allow that option to be, again, more flexible and just give projects more ability to meet this path. So happy to take any questions, discussion on allowing this proposal to move forward to provide more flexibility to projects.
Hi, gang, it's Linda. I guess my question is just about whether the language in 1.2.2 has been vetted by landlords and Xcel, that this is the right way to capture that.
Right. This language itself aligns with the Energized Denver language in the ordinance. And Katrina, maybe you can help clarify that, but I believe that was vetted through that process that you all held.
Yeah, that's right. The solar language is pretty well vetted through, it's both in our green, it's very similar and parallel to what's in our green building ordinance, what is in Energized Denver. And it allows for all of Xcel's longer term subscription programs to count and not their month-to-month short-term subscription program, which had been called Wind Source and is going to be called Renewable Connect short-term subscriptions in the future, because that would be hard to regulate and monitor, right? Like if someone had canceled, we wouldn't know if someone canceled their month-to-month subscription. So this covers kind of every other way of installing renewables or owning renewables locally.
Are there any other questions or topic of discussion we want to talk through? Or does everyone feel generally comfortable with the idea of adding the flexibility into the Denver Green Code? Again, this path does exist currently. It just adds that extra layer of options. John?
It looks like it probably would make sense to add Appendix SE and PT for the in accordance with Section C407, just so that if a project is using one of those appendices for compliance, they don't have to do another compliance model.
Okay. And where in this language would you propose that being added?
So in that, I believe it's the very first sentence, it says buildings shall be provided with an on-site renewable energy system capable of, and at the end of the sentence, it says, in accordance with Section C407.
Mm-hmm.
I think you would just add or Appendix SE or Appendix SE or PT, I guess is the right phrasing for that.
Okay. Did that capture what you're intending?
Yeah, I guess that first
Sure.
or should just be a comma.
That's true. Thanks, John. So I will open it up just to, these meetings are for us to come to a consensus. There's no formal voting. So I'll ask the question, unless anyone needs more time to review this, I'll just ask the question. Does anyone oppose to moving this proposal forward?
I had another comment.
Yep, go ahead,
And
Linda.
it's just it's not on the text that's on the screen, so I was hanging on to it, but I'll get it out there now. So in the just a few bullets down where it's the 6.2.1 occupancy. So basically, many things can happen in a building, but the 6.2.1 occupancy about showing proof of zero net energy is only one for the building was not as occupied as was intended during that period. So there's only, you didn't use as much as you expected as far as normalization would go. And so just wanted to check that that's the intent, that it kind of is the only extenuating circumstance is that your building was not as occupied as intended. And no other normalization strategies or techniques would be used.
And Linda, I'm trying to find exactly where.
Just scroll a little bit down.
Oh.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so this is the language that's currently in the Denver Green Code. I believe, the answer to your question is yes, this would be the way to provide that documentation to show the different occupancy. Are you asking if there's other ways to kind of shift the requirements?
about shifting the requirements. I'm just saying that lots of things change in the way buildings are occupied. Buildings that have variable occupancy by their nature can vary up, it can vary down. This occupancy only shows it varies down. There are other things about we could have a severe winter or summer, which would be weather normalization. There could be, some act of God on the renewable energy that you've installed on site or you've contracted with. So, like this says the only recognition is that perhaps you didn't occupy it as much, so perhaps you didn't use as much, and perhaps you didn't need as much offsite renewable to make that up. But there are many, many other circumstances that happen in showing actual zero net energy performance. So just want to see whether the intent is to have all of those other circumstances intentionally be excluded.
Yeah, it's a great question, Linda. Maybe Christy or Eric, if you want to speak to this as well, as this was developed several years ago, this portion of it, if you remember the intent behind it, or welcome any feedback.
I think the intent at the time was, and I'm trying to find the language and I have to go back and look. But at the time, I think we said it as zero net energy would be defined by using 110% or less of what was predicted, to give a little bit of a grace there. And then the intent was for project teams to really push themselves to be as predictive as possible, allowing for that 10% grace. There wasn't an intention to respond to, I think the idea was the team needs to be considering what reasonable weather patterns might be relevant to this project in the 24 months after construction, or trying to foresee those things that can affect the performance and change the energy usage. So there wasn't a desire to give a whole bunch of off ramps. The desire was to give that 10% leeway to allow the teams to really make it work. And because the proof of zero net energy only gets shown once, 24 months after construction, it's not that during the life of the building a whole bunch of things would change that and then have the project fall out of compliance. It's that the reasonable intentions of the team have been met.
And I would just add, if we did decide we wanted to include some additional information to capture those, what ifs, like major hailstorm that damages the system, or something like that. If there's language or a reference, Linda, that you're familiar with, that we could use, I think that would certainly be helpful, versus kind of editing it on the fly as we're discussing it here. So I'm just curious if there's a reference that you're familiar with, Linda, that might be helpful in considering language.
I am not at the top of my head. I think that the ones that I'm most familiar with, say from the Living Futures for Living Buildings, that it's a, you're going to do it. There is no technical sidestepping it. This is just, you will demonstrate that you've got enough renewables to offset your use, period, right? The technical side steps are not included in those. And those are voluntary rating systems. This this green code would also be voluntary. So, and I'm not familiar with code ordinances where that's been hammered out in a different way. You know, the certification folks are like, you'll just do it, you'll just get it done, right? And we're not going to talk about how you didn't get there.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, I feel like, you know, from a jurisdictional perspective, you know, we'd be reasonable. I mean, something happens that's, you know, catastrophic to, you know, showing compliance. You know, it's not, it's not, you know, too bad, so sad, you know, not that there's particular penalty anyway, but, you know, I think that there's a recognition of, you know, wanting to work with, you know, with the project, with the team to identify, you know, if something substantial went wrong, then, you know, we document that, we learn from it, that sort of thing.
And I would layer in there that the ILFI guidelines are what we looked at originally. That was just because they've had success with their projects and with their program. So we reference that, and those are the standards that a modified version of their submittal standards are what we share with teams who pursue this path so that they know what they need to show us. So that, Linda, you mentioning that is, it's in alignment with where our minds were when this was created as one of the options for a path.
Okay, real good. And that 10% that you mentioned, is that included here or in any other reference documents?
I need to go back and look at the language in the chapter because I know we talked about it, but I haven't read that chapter. I've got to be honest, it's been probably, I mean, just too long. So it should be referenced in there. I believe it's referenced in there. If it's not, then we'll need to make sure that it's in our policy document. But that is the intent.
Well, I guess I appreciate your stance that this approach is basically moving to as stringent as the Living Future certification, which is great. Just that my intent was in checking that that's truly what the objective is. That concludes my comments.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks everyone. That was a really helpful discussion. Are there any other questions or concerns we want to talk through on this proposal? Give people another second to chime in. All right, I will revisit the question from before. Does anyone have any objections to moving this proposal forward to City Council? And I will take the lack of hands as a agreement to move this forward. So thank you, everyone. And we will move on to the next proposal. And I will hand this one off to Sean.
All right, so this proposal is pretty straightforward. We have had a couple other proposals for demand responsive controls. And really all this does is it says if you use luminaire level lighting controls to comply with the controls requirements for lighting, that those controls also need to be demand responsive controls. So it doesn't require luminaire level lighting controls. It doesn't require demand responsive controls in all cases. It only requires demand responsive controls when you have luminaire level lighting controls. In general, these are sophisticated controls like a BAS that have, it's usually a matter of just programming, turning the options on, and so that they can receive the demand responsive signal. So pretty straightforward, I think.
And Sean, just to clarify, this is for the IECC, so not a Denver Green Code proposal.
Yes.
open it up to any discussion, questions. I certainly never want to rush the process of everyone reading, but I'm trying to understand the silence here. Do we need another minute, or do we all feel comfortable? I think I will ask the the question of Eric. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay.
pretty basic. I think it's
Okay.
fine.
All right. So does everyone feel, or so let me rephrase that. Does anyone object to moving this proposal forward to City Council? Okay. Well, that was very quick. So thank you everyone for your efficiency there. So 36, we will move forward. The next proposal we have is from Mike Fulton, 12.3, and I believe Mike is on the line, correct? Yes.
I am.
So Mike, I'll screen share and tell me where to scroll as you're going through this. Make sure I'm covering what you want to see.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is a modification of the amendment that was accepted in 2018 based on some input from Chuck in terms of enforcing, and then also based on some updated information. So big picture, there's probably the biggest changes are changing from 50% to 60% enthalpy recovery ratio, then clarifying that that's at balanced airflow conditions, because with energy recovery, if you don't have as much air going out, it's much harder to do the enthalpy recovery ratio. So so we clarify that, and then we actually put in a factor that if you have unbalanced airflows, that you can adjust the enthalpy recovery ratio, which is not the case currently. And I can get into a lot of that minutia. I think we've talked about it in this a few times, so I think everybody's understanding that. Then we do talk about striking a bypass and changing it to bypasses. And that's mainly for products with energy recovery that do not have a control like a heat wheel that you can turn the energy recovery off. So that'd be like a plate heat exchanger or heat pipe or runaround loop. And so if you don't have bypasses on both sides, you can still recover energy when you don't intend to, and it can add to your load. And then the next change was with Chuck's input, we increased the pressure drop to 1.1 inches. The way the code's actually written, if you back the math in, they base the pressure drop around a 0.6 at sea level. And in some cases, that's a little low for current technology. And so what we did here was say, you can go with a higher pressure drop, but you would need bypass dampers in economizer mode to get down to that lower pressure. And then lastly, currently there's an exception in the code for supply fan efficiency. If you scroll back up, sorry, just a little bit. I'm talking about the very last point. And so the supply and exhaust fan static efficiency, just clarifying that it has to meet the table, because there is an exception for packaged equipment where they can just use the brake horsepower per CFM, which at low statics allows you to have, we calculated 35% efficient fans, which really is, that then you can end up with a product that has a parasitic load. So there's a lot there. And then the last thing is, I think on the tables, we lowered the values for two reasons. One was in the last round, it was kind of, to push in under 8,000 hours, there was no requirement for energy recovery. So, to put it back in the code. And then we did some more analysis, and it was actually, when you look at packaged units, it's actually a lot less expensive. So we pushed the energy recovery down. It's one of the best ways to get energy efficiency in a building. And then scroll down a little bit further. We modified exception 6 just to clarify that in our climate zone, heating enthalpy recovery ratio is required. Then exception 8 has always been a bit of a problem, because what people would do is they would design 2 exhaust fans into a system that would then get them to have less than 75% exhaust and wouldn't have to do energy recovery, even though it's economical. So that just clarifies that. It does drop the threshold a little bit based on economics from 75 to 60%. And we have some supporting data down below. Number 12 is just a designer's point to give them an alternate on how to design energy recovery, to let people know if their ratio is below 60% but above the table threshold, that they can do a bypass on the outside air. And then lastly, the lab exception allows for a lower enthalpy recovery ratio, which was apparently the reason 50% was chosen in the first place, was for labs instead of the other way around. So hopefully I didn't go too fast and lose everybody. I know that was a lot, so I'm sure there's some questions.
Thanks, Mike. Let's open the floor for discussion, questions. Any clarification questions too you'd like Mike to go back and revisit, or if there's any questions in the supporting documentation, I'm sure he's happy to answer that.
I guess I'll jump in. I guess one of the challenges with the current, well, the way this is written, and the question I've sort of asked from the beginning is, if you have a large exhaust, but you don't, I mean, because IECC and ASHRAE solely look at the quantity of supply air and not the exhaust, and then determine it that way. So in this case, if we have an exhaust fan that exceeds one of the table values, the supply air is divided up amongst multiple RTUs or whatever, and so there's not as much at a single location. Would they still have to provide energy recovery?
Yes. If they're above the value in the exhaust, they would. Now that could be done multiple ways. If they had multiple rooftop units, well, yes, and it depends. So if they're below 50%, then so if the rooftop units are below 50%, then they would not, because there's unless they're 24/7, but really we didn't change the table's no different on the 24/7 than it was. It's just reformatted a little bit to be more clear. In the less than 24/7, so like an office building, that kind of thing, if you're below 50%, you would not have to do energy recovery. If you're above 50% and you had, one exhaust that was being served by an area that had greater outside air than 50%, then you would. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we're still dependent on the supply air to determine whether or not energy recovery is required for the exhaust.
Correct. A percentage of supply air.
The percentage of supply air. Regardless of, so like exception 8 has an exception for when the exhaust is provided at multiple locations in smaller values. Should there be a similar exception created for the supply air, if the supply air is divided up amongst many pieces of equipment and not in any large quantity?
That
or
would
any
probably
quan-
be a good clarification. Yeah.
Chuck, can I chime in on that particular issue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is actually the design and enforcement question. This is all trigger, remember, on fan systems. So going to, and both the base code as well as old amendments and this amendment, go up to the top again about the charging language there. So where outside airflows of and I can understand why we've changed fan systems, but either with or without fan in there, but it's about a system. And the question has always been, or should always be, what's a system? If there, because of the multiple supply systems, as an example, if I have a PTAC with a hole in the wall that's bringing in 50 CFM on a very large building, hotel or something, every individual system only has 50 CFM and therefore is not triggered. If I choose to use a DOAS system for that same system, now I've got a system that, first of all, it probably runs more than 8,000 hours, and now that system has essentially 100% outside air. So it gets interesting in how you choose to do things. If I was directed by an owner to loophole this, first of all, let me say that it's very much harder to loophole this in Denver than anywhere else, primarily because of exception 8, and has the last rounds have been too, because that's all we had to do was, even in a real building, not a PTAC building, that you look at and say that should have energy recovery. All you had to do is provide more than one exhaust fan, right? And you met exception 8. So thank you for if this is what we're trying to do, and we are, that really covers it. Also, I think, Chuck, that the values that are in there are workable, but it's going to require heat recovery just about everywhere. And yeah, that's what Mike's saying, is that it makes sense just about everywhere. So the question is, what's a system? What's a VRF system with, it depends on how you bring the outside air into each fan, right? Because there's a lot of other things that talk about in the code that would say that a 500 CFM fan coil, or VRF, is its own system, right? Doesn't require smoke shutdowns, unless it's in a common plenum, right? So what's a system? And therefore, I'm going to suggest that the language is similar to what the base code has. I already heard the word policy brought up today. that's where this needs to be, I think. And I think that's how you get to the enforcement and those. Can I also comment? Well, yeah, if I may, I will also comment on the industrial or institutional and laboratory stuff. I may have mentioned I get millions of square feet of hospital and all that stuff. Again, we are subject to a lot of different authorities having jurisdiction. I think this is a good way to allow for us to say that we can't use a leaky heat recovery system in these areas, even if you would, because it's just environmental air. But ASHRAE 170 says that air coming from certain types of areas of the hospital can't have leaky heat exchangers. So, and therefore it makes us, first of all, I could have, and okay, I have, used that loophole to avoid heat recovery in hospitals that, dang, it should have heat recovery. This will have to do with heat recovery. Good on Denver. But it does allow me to use a non-leaky heat recovery system at a lower efficiency. What I would ask is, why is all of these tweaks and air pressure drop requirements and imbalanced airflow, many of the things, only associated with everything except multifamily and dorms and all that sort of thing? Because the paragraph on non-transient dwelling units isn't being touched, and that's its own standalone paragraph, and therefore it's just no enhancements to that. So consider that.
Yeah, I agree. And one point that I failed to make earlier is that section that's before this section actually requires 60% enthalpy recovery ratio. But it does not have a sliding scale based on exhaust to outside air CFM. So.
And air pressure drop and those sort of things too. So.
Right.
So in the laboratory high occupancy exception, we're still looking at enthalpy recovery ratio. Now the different recovery methods typically are just sensible recovery. You're just recovering sensible energy, and those. Is there a reason why we're still? I mean.
So let me jump into that. The difference between, I absolutely agree that it should be sensible in our climate. As I was writing this, that's just such a big can of worms to open that, it's almost like you're totally redoing the standard. So, I'm open to coming up with a plan for that because I do think that's the right thing to do. But since this is what ASHRAE requires or code requires, I wasn't going to wade into that portion.
And Mike, I concur with you on that. And we, by the way, we have kind of worked together. Mike did bring in stakeholders throughout his process here. Enthalpy in our climate, a regular selection, a good selection would be the same because, first of all, we're not required to do cooling. So therefore, there's no incentive to try to recover, latent heat from the outside of the inside. If anything, it's a good thing to bring in all of our dry air. Okay, so a good selection would therefore be looking at the cold side of things, which inherently is works out the same essentially, whether it's enthalpy or sensible. Now, there's still some design reasons in my hospitals that we have to humidify. I might want to recover some humidity. But I probably don't want to, because that actually transfers even more nasty stuff. So let me design it, and don't mess with the code too much. That was Mike's other reasoning, is that it follows ASHRAE, follows the base code. It doesn't hurt in our climate. A design reason, what I wouldn't, there's reasons I wouldn't choose a total energy wheel, but that's a design reason, and you can't regulate stupid, I guess. That's where I'm going with that. I can still be stupid.
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge Mark's help in rewriting this. It is, we took a lot of your comments, Chuck, and Mark's comments to make this, I think, better.
Yeah, and I guess that would be my
and Mike,
question.
by the way, just to throw that one in there, I've been meeting with some other vendors too, you know this, and I passed this by them. They're good with the pressure drop now. I think that might have been the issue before, right? So I can say the industry is good with the pressure drops and the values.
So do you think, Mark, it's necessary to specify the pressure drop in the energy recovery here versus just in the fan power consumption section that looks at just the fan power consumption, that has the table that has the allowance for the energy recovery units?
That's exactly what it is. It's an allowance. It only lets me credit 0.6 inches of static, right? If I do a poor enough selection that I have to buy enough fan for 1.2, but I'm only credited 0.6, I better figure out how else to meet my fan energy budget. And Denver's reduced that. So.
Well, and the problem, Chuck, on the fan credit is, it's dependent on the currently the way that it's calculated is dependent on the enthalpy recovery ratio. So the higher the enthalpy recovery ratio, the higher the pressure drop, which is fine, except that obviously you can, say an average system has 2 inches external, but your system has 1, you can chew up that extra inch in a fan power allowance, because the brake horsepower is just brake horsepower divided by CFM, and that's what you get. And so, if you have a really short duct, say you're 1/10 of an inch, you could put in a really bad heat exchanger. And I've seen them on schedules, 1.5, 2 inches. And when you run through the math, it's just this parasitic load that, on a design day is okay, but it's the 45-degree day where you need to recover some heat that you're just chewing up fan energy and using more energy than you're saving.
That's right, and therefore that was our discussion, Mike. I remember that, and therefore you needed it in both places, right? You don't want to, go to allow us or whatever to find that loophole, allow just the heat exchanger to eat it all up, right? So, you know what? You can get, still can gain the energy recovery value, but that's just crediting the biggest fan you can put in there. I'm not sure I'd mess with it. That's the whole thing.
I do want to be mindful of time.
I
This
know
has
this.
been a very exciting conversation.
And I think that's where we were before. I don't think we want to mess with it. I'll leave it at that.
It from what I'm hearing, it sounds like there's general agreement. If there is a detail that needs to be worked through, I think we can, move this forward with the intent to modify that detail if there is that suggestion. So Chuck, Mike, and Mark, and of course everyone else. But is there something that we want to intend to modify moving forward?
So, I mean, we've talked about multiple things that could be slightly tweaked or modified. My concern with this proposal, and I'm not arguing with the technical basis of this proposal or the energy savings that could be realized with this proposal. we had a much simpler proposal that went through last code cycle, and it was, I'd say, one of the top two that I received multiple phone calls on for complexity. This proposal is much more complex than what was passed last time, with the unbalanced system now being included. Mike has shared with me an email with an ASHRAE board member about ASHRAE considering some of these items for ASHRAE, and it was indicated that there would be months of analysis to involved with that. And so my big fear with this proposal is just the complexity of it. How is it, the enforcement of it, the supporting the design community to be successful to meeting it. And so, I mean, my question to Mark is, like, does it seem like we've overcomplicated it versus what we have today, where we simply reduce the, we modified the table to lower the thresholds of when energy is recovered. And then we also modified exception 8 to lower that value to prevent the design of the 2 exhaust fans to circumvent the need for energy recovery. Because I feel like number 12, if somebody called and asked me, like, when do you see exception number 12, when do you see this specifically going to be implied or required, I'd have a, it's going to take some explaining to get there. And so that's my fear with this proposal is it's a very complex proposal on top of all the other energy proposals that have been adopted this code cycle, which this code has become a beast. And I'm just being honest with that.
I guess to ask me, you're asking a if I don't say so myself, we have a good round of clients. Let me put it that way. Therefore, I get to work on a lot of the good stuff. I can see that this can be a problem, especially if you're trying to get away with something. It would be just put in a heat recovery system and be done with it. How many hours did you take to figure out the loopholes here? It'd be my advice to my junior engineers. So there's one designer input to that. I hesitate to go further because of time. I did state I think it's okay, but it's complicated. Denver's amping it up, guys, and this is one more example, Chuck. And I think, okay, so 12, actually, it's a good, there's design issues that this comes up in, and I could say all the time, but, this is simply a 10,000 CFM outside air building that only needs 1,200 CFM of bathroom exhaust, right? Just an office building with a high occupancy. So that could happen. It does happen. And therefore, that all this complexity does 2 things. One, that's imbalanced right there. You'll never get 60% when you've only got 1,500 CF, and we need to pressurize the building, right? So I can't just bring outside air, or I shouldn't, a good designer shouldn't just take building air and throw it away because we need it for pressurization.
Got it. Well, and then I guess my other question is just the availability of equipment. I know just based on what Denver passed last time, there's been projects that have had trouble finding energy recovery units to meet our requirements. And so, I mean, we've had a project that we had to issue a temporary certificate of occupancy because the lead time for the equipment's like 6 months out.
Well,
We've had, and I don't know if that's just supply issues in the world we're living in now, or not. But are off-the-shelf package systems readily available that meet this, or are these all custom units that are going to be required?
So let me address that. I think that it is supply chain issues. We've seen it across the board. Lead times are twice as long as they were. So absolutely think that that's part of this. Then the other part is to Mark's point, that 0.6 inches that was in the code previously now is 1.1, which is gonna Mark did check with other vendors and they have said that that's meetable now. And in fact, Mark, you've run this by other vendors, right? And they said that was okay.
Okay, Denver's amping it up. This is not the Home Depot energy recovery unit with a couple, fan energy issues. The thing that might, you could just find something to be a greater parasitic loss. This is requiring the good stuff, and I spoke with vendors who can provide the good stuff. So. And it gets where it gets interesting. Here's where it gets interesting: is at the low end. It also gets interesting because of the. You want to go here, but I'll first of all, this goes to the non-transient thing, but also just in general, affordable housing, right? So non-transient does indeed require energy recovery and doesn't have some of these breaks. First of all, but.
So does
That's one
Chuck
thing
just,
that's
sorry, I don't mean to
please.
again cut this thrilling conversation off. I know this has been really helpful for y'all to discuss. Chuck, does that help answer some of your questions? I'm trying to see how we can move forward with this. I'm not trying to rush it, but again, we do have quite a few proposals to get through. If there's something we can take a little bit offline again of intending to modify, I think the group would probably be open to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is just the complexity, and I technically I don't see issue with it. It's just it's
the three of us might, I don't know, what's our direction? It was a good discussion the other day from elected officials saying we've got to pass this, made it an issue. What is there a way to get the feel of the group of, does Denver want to go, amp it up like I've been saying, and ask Chuck to enforce it? I can't make that judgment.
Well, and Chuck, I did put together a spreadsheet that I'd be happy to give to you to, look at what the enthalpy recovery requirement would be with a site chart. So I think it would make it easy on this, unbalanced airflow calc so that, it's a quick couple, a quick little bit of math to figure out. And I'm happy to help, come up with any kind of tools that would help as well.
Yeah, and so I mean that's my thing is that we've already amped it up by requiring it in Denver. ASHRAE, IECC don't require energy recovery for most part in our climate zone. We amped it up last code cycle, and this is taking it to a whole nother level. And I'm not sure this is. I'm just hesitant right now for the complexity, but I'd be willing to discuss it offline to help to move this meeting along.
Do you want to set up a time, Chuck? Maybe me, you, and Mark, or you and me, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's best today because I don't feel comfortable adopting this because I know this, just the way this is, the complexity of it, we are going to have a policy, a training, all sorts of things created to support the designers to be able to do this on top of what else has been adopted in the energy code, pushing the envelope here in Denver. And so that's my hesitation with this.
Okay.
So hearing that, Chuck, I guess maybe a question to the group would be, would this group be comfortable moving this forward while sending it to, you know, a subcommittee between Mike, Mark, and Chuck to figure out some of those details, potentially simplify it, make it more enforceable? Does the group overall feel comfortable doing that? And Eric, I also look to you too. Is that okay to do that moving forward?
I think if the folks that are on this call, this meeting, are also in agreement that if it's determined that the viability of language in this proposal, even if reduced, is not appropriate for adoption this code cycle, that could be a possible outcome. That's part of the bigger picture discussion. Or maybe I should say the sidebar discussion. So as long as we're in agreement on that, then generally speaking, yeah, I'm okay to leave it in the hands of those far more competent than I in the discussion of these technical items. Yeah, I think if it can be reduced and simplified, potentially, yeah, maybe it ends up in there, but I have to acknowledge the ability of Denver staff to review and enforce this and to manage questions externally as well. So I want to do the right thing, but I want to make sure that we have the capacity to do the right thing.
Well, and to be clear, you know, in my mind, this is as close to perfect as we can get. But I don't want to have perfect be the enemy of good. So, you know, if we need to modify something to make it, you know, easier for people to understand and, you know, dumb it down, then that's fine.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone, you know, object to what Eric was stating? We'll put it in the hands of the kind of subcommittee here, and they can determine what the next right steps are. Understanding we're trying to move it forward, but there's always a possibility that it just does not make it in this code cycle. So if anyone objects to that, please let me know, and we'll just move forward with that understanding.
Well, and I would like to suggest that if this doesn't make it forward, at the very least, what we had in the last cycle makes it forward.
Yeah, I'd support what was in the last cycle moves forward, and possibly even some sort of somewhere in between. But I think it would be worth discussing in a subcommittee and maybe reaching out to some of the main committee members like Ken Urbanek and see if he would be willing to sit in and get a fresh set of eyes on this and see what their group thinks of.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We will move forward for the sake of time. I appreciate the conversation. John, I'm going to hand it off to you. If we can give a brief summary of this. I know we've heard it once or twice, so I don't think we have to start from the beginning. Thank you.
The mic off. On. Thank you. So yeah, there's two proposals we'll presenting today. This first one is with regards to air leakage for the building envelope, and kind of a pithy way of saying it would be that the building envelope is only as good as its weakest link. But the intent of this is to clarify the requirements to not allow compliance prescriptively for air leakage via only identifying either materials or building assemblies and their air permeance. So you know, one could say that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for a tight building envelope. So this proposal doesn't change. Sorry. So this proposal doesn't change the leakage requirements per se, but it directs people towards the testing, which is the I think 0.6 CFM per square foot at 75 pascals, and then retesting if they don't meet that leakage rate. So the essential elements of this proposal are to, number one, to eliminate the exception that allows compliance via stating materials or assembly component performance. And then secondly, removing those sections from the prescriptive code. So hopefully this one should be relatively straightforward. This is a base code measure, so yeah, so that's kind of a high level summary. I can certainly take any questions as needed. The next one's a little bit more in depth, so I want to leave a little time for that, but I also don't want to shortchange this proposal.
And John, can you confirm that from the discussion we had last time in the comments that those have been picked up and addressed?
Yes, they have. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So the language is clarified too, so that the sections related to compliance with material for envelope performance, air permeance, and or assembly permeance is no longer allowed as a sole means of demonstrating compliance with the air barrier requirements.
Hey, John, this is Paul Kreischer. I haven't had the pleasure of being on many of these meetings, but our company does a lot of air tightness testing. I just want to be sure when you're saying the 0.6 standard at 75 pascals, was that correct? Because the code has long been 0.4 and the Army Corps of Engineers is 0.25. So just
well, I believe I might have to look this up. I've done a tiny bit of envelope testing myself, but I believe it's 0.6 at 75 pascals and 0.4 at 50 pascals, which might be more common for residential buildings. But if that's
from my experience on commercial buildings, and we've done a lot of them, it's 0.4 CFM per square foot of conditioned surface area at 75 pascals. So I don't want us inadvertently taking a step back. In the 2018 code, I'm quite positive it's that. In Fort Collins, it's been 0.4, and Boulder, it's been 0.4, but we're right now, if we take it back to 0.6, we're going lower than what the commercial code has been for a very long time, and it's not difficult for commercial buildings to meet 0.4. To 5, the Army Corps of Engineers standard is more stringent, but we still have buildings meeting that at 75 pascals in Fort Collins and then on Army bases and other places like that. So I'm just curious how the 0.6 may have gotten into there, but we should go back and check. The ICC has it being 0.4 CFM per square foot of conditioned floor area at 75 pascals.
So the 2021 IECC is 0.4, and what it allows for is it allows you to fail, basically. And if you fail to 0.6, then you have to take remedial steps, and but you can't fall below 0.6. It's a kind of a transitional mandatory envelope testing. And I am looking up if there are, I'm looking it up right now to see if there are any, how it interacts with this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we've been enforcing 0.4 in many other parts of the state.
Yeah, I mean, there was some latitude given, I think, as Sean mentioned, for the retesting if it fails and is above that threshold. To make 100% sure I have the right levels, I might want to go back and verify these numbers.
Thank you. Sean might be doing that right now as well, John, but so very good. Yeah, I just don't, as we're trying to enforce strong, good high performance levels of energy efficiency, I'll just say in the dozens of commercial buildings that I've been personally involved with, 0.4 is not a difficult standard to meet, so long as there's good design criteria and air barriers clearly called out on the plans. The subcontractors know what they're bidding to get there. It's not a difficult standard. The 0.25 of the Army Corps has been more of like the high water mark, high benchmark, but
yes. So yeah, thank you for the comment. And this would be a question for the group, because I checked the ICC 2021 standard does have 0.4 CFM per square foot at 75 pascals, and it's a requirement. So I guess the question is, should there be, since this is a new requirement to require testing in all cases, a little bit of latitude for projects that fail and retest to a certain level?
I'd advocate that there could be that flexibility, if kind of what Sean was alluding to, if you fail at the 0.4, that you must remedy it to at least a 0.6. But I thought in the Denver's code, I was on the committee in 2018, but I was more on the residential side, but I thought we had it where you could fail, but you needed to try and work towards getting to a 0.4 and then show what your improvements led to. Like if you tested a 0.7, oh, but you got it to a 0.5, kudos for you, you know, just to see that there was improvements made to, you know, that you learn from it as a builder, basically, and try and make the building better. But I mean, it's one of those things I might recommend that the building department could keep under their hat as opposed to have it being less written, where it's like, oh, you got to meet 0.4, but we can give latitude if you've not, you know, I mean, that's kind of how it's been in reality anyway. It's like at some point you can try and fix everything in an existing building, but it's very difficult if you're like, oh, we're at 0.7, to get it to 0.4 is extremely difficult. You got to do it before the drywall and everything goes on. Otherwise, it's very challenging to get there. Anyway, I'll stop derailing, but Sean, maybe I gave you enough time. You know, he's still looking, I think.
So there is an exception for buildings between 5,000 and 50,000 square feet, group R occupancies from the testing requirement in 2021. So if you wanted to make mandatory testing, the simplest way to do that would be to just strike that exception that is under C 402.5.1.2 under number 2. So that would be the simplest way to make it mandatory, and then we have these most of what's here already, because it already has that meet 0.4. If you fail 0.4, but you're at least under 0.6, then you do take these remediation steps, but you can't be below 0.6. I'm not sure where this language is from. I think this might be from a.
Yeah, I agree with Sean's query, because our current amendments to this section look quite a bit different from what we have here. So I have to echo Paul's comment and concern regarding the numerical values for the leakage rates. John, I think we need to cross-reference and check this with Denver's existing amendments in the 2019 document for the section 402.5.1.2 and 3. I think a little bit of reconciliation needs to come to that, and I believe that the 0.4 is an appropriate number that will replace the 0.6 here. We could certainly discuss further after we take a look at it, but it does look like there's some differentiating language there.
Good. I'll just finish by saying what Sean had stated. I could be comfortable for, you know, voting on in our next committee meeting if it was 0.4 as a minimum, giving a latitude that you could be, if you fail, you must at least bring it to a 0.6. And then you guys know there'll be scenarios where there'll be a building that just will have an extremely hard time even getting to that. But we can, you know, the building department unfortunately gets to cross that bridge, I guess, when that comes up. But I think as it's written, it should be saying do everything in your power to get to 0.4. I wish we offered incentives to get people to the 0.25 of the Army Corps of Engineers, or we need to do more education with builders to show them that's not, there are buildings meeting that standard that aren't doing exceptional things. They're not doing spray foam everywhere. They're not, they're not going crazy. They're just building very well, building very good stuff. So anyway, I'll finish with that.
Yeah, I mean, that seems appropriate to me. Thank you. I think having a lower standard, obviously there's at least some incentive to try for that so they don't have to retest and do remediation steps. Yeah, and as stated, as Sean stated, so the striking out of this exception 3 would make the leakage testing mandatory for those buildings, 5,000 to 50,000 square feet.
I think that maybe even before that, this language doesn't align with what's in the Denver Energy Code right now, and it doesn't align with the 2021 IECC. So whatever goes through needs to be based on the 2021, because that's the code, that's the model code that's being adopted.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So to resolve this and move forward, again, acknowledging that this is the last supplemental hearing that we do have scheduled, it sounds like the group agrees with that it should be a 0.4, give allowance for buildings to fix and get to 0.6 for those that don't meet that 0.4, and then for John to go through and verify the right language aligns with the 2021 IECC and the Denver Code amendments. I want to make sure I'm hearing all that right. We don't have it. Go ahead, Paul.
I was gonna say that matches my understanding, Courtney,
Okay.
to do that. But
Okay.
again, when it would come up for a vote, I would move that as something to vote on.
Okay, and so Paul, this, just to clarify, this isn't going to the formal code committees. This is kind of our time here, just because there's been so many amendments to get through. So I just want to make sure that we're all on that same page, because as a consensus, we would agree to that, and that would be kind of the vote to move that forward right here. Does that make sense?
So moved by me.
Okay.
I don't know how much Robert's rules we're using here, but anyway.
Yeah,
Anyway.
this is a little more informal process here.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so does anyone object to what we just stated here? Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. John, I think we've got some clear directions here. We'll follow up on that. Let's go through batteries.
Before you
Yep.
move on, can I just plant a seed that there should be some discussion that I'd be open to being a part of after all this, to think about educational efforts and or if there's any incentives that could be provided to commercial builders trying to get to the Army Corps standard. So in other words, not just the stick of the code saying you must be 0.4, but trying to do things through education or bribery to get people to say, oh, I'll prove to you I can build to the 0.25 standard that the Army Corps of Engineers has had for 30 years, basically. So, so just an idea, because we should.
Absolutely. We would appreciate that. I've got a note for Tom here to follow up with you, and he'll help. He's going to help get some education and incentives together. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. 4B, and
Okay.
John, if you want to go through this, I'll try to get rid of this.
Yes.
Track changes. Where's?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of. So this next proposal is a green code proposal, and it follows some work that was done, for the California jurisdiction that would be applicable in Denver for projects that have already have planned to or are required to have photovoltaics on site or rooftop PV generation. And what the requirement is, this is slightly aspirational, but this is a requirement for projects that do have PV, that they're also required to have some level of battery storage system on site. And what that does is primarily for aligning or addressing the misalignment of the on-site generation with the demands of the building and the difficulties with exporting increasing amounts of energy to the grid and through, to the utility. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the buildings themselves and the utilities. And the requirement is that, so all buildings that are required to have a PV system shall also have a battery storage system meeting the minimum qualification requirements. And those requirements are rated energy and power capacity. And the way those are structured to be proportional to the size of the PV system that's installed. So if you see down to the table A for the battery storage capacity factors, excuse me. For example, for office building, that 1.68, that means that for every watt of PV that's DC that you have installed on the roof, you would have 1.68 watt hours of battery storage available on site. These factors, or the sizing of the systems, were not designed to store every possible last watt of excess energy that's generated from the PV systems, but rather they're used more for for demand response, for offloading some of the shifting the energy loads, and to limit exports, such that the exported generation was no more than approximately 20% of the entire production of the system. This kind of follows the issues that California has been seeing with increased renewable production at the source, and the duck curve, where the loads from the buildings are shifting later in the day towards roughly 4 to 8 p.m. and the production PV, certainly for most systems, would be maximum somewhere near noon. So the requirement here is to have battery systems on site installed. This is for new buildings. And this is, again, it's a green code optional requirement. And as far as justification, there are systems available. Obviously, this is a somewhat new approach in the sense that there certainly aren't as many battery systems installed as there are PV systems installed in buildings, but the installed capacity is growing. And the other component is that the cost of these systems, while expensive now, is dropping precipitously. So, in 2015, it was something on the order of $1,800 per I believe per watt hour or kilowatt hour, and it's dropped by more than half since then. And the analysis that was done for the other jurisdiction, granted these are other rates, so it's not entirely applicable to here, but just as a reference point, the battery systems by themselves are not necessarily cost effective, but when PV is coupled with batteries, they often are. So that's why this made it into the base code for California for a limited set of building types. I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions on the kind of the intent and the structure of this proposal.
Hi, John. I have a question. This is Carol. I'm hoping you can help me to understand the exceptions, because I was looking at the third exception, last sentence, for a single tenant buildings with less than 5,000 square feet of conditioned floor area, no battery storage system is required. So my assumption is, if it's 5,000 and above, it would require a battery storage system. That's at least how I see it. So when I go to exception 1, though, it says no battery storage system is required if the installed PV system size is less than 0.25 kW DC capacity per square foot of conditioned floor area. So if I have a 6,000 square foot, it could be anything, restaurant, retail space, but I have a 6,000 square foot commercial building, single tenant building. So for 3, under exception 3, it would automatically be required the way it's written, or at least that's my assumption, since it is 5,000 and above. But if you go to 1, it would not, a battery system would not be required if for 6,000 square foot, unless it has a PV system of 1.5 megawatts, which is huge. So can you, in order, based upon the exception, can you help me to understand this? Because I'm confused here. I see a little bit of a conflict. One says you have to have an energy storage, a battery storage system. The other one says you don't. And in my case, the 6,000 square foot building, you have to have a 1.5 megawatts. So I'm confused on this.
Okay, so yeah, I might need to review this carefully to give a perfectly appropriate answer, but the intent of the exception 1 is that if you're installing a PV system that is sufficiently low capacity where you would not benefit from the battery storage, then it wouldn't be required. So certainly for exception 3, exempting multi-tenant buildings with lower floor area. If you could, Courtney, if you could scroll down or up to that equation A, maybe we could look. Where is it?
I don't see it. Am I missing it? I see equation B and C. I can maybe unhide.
But would those tables even apply if they meet the exceptions? And then you have the conflict of if it's 5,000 or more, 3 says you have to have a battery storage system, or 1 says you may not have to.
Well, I think
Regardless
if
of
you
what the
meet
table
any
says.
of the exceptions, then
Well, there's a
then
conflict.
you don't have to
You
have
may
it.
meet one exception, but you are in violation of the other one. Is what I'm getting at. Like for 3 single tenant buildings with less than 5,000 square feet, no battery storage system is required. So if you're over 5,000 and above, you would. But what if you're over 5,000, but you don't meet 1, then you're exempt. So now you have a conflict between 3 and 1. 1 says you don't have to have an energy storage system, battery storage system. 3 says you do, regardless of what the tables say.
Is it just a question of the wording of the exception? Because I guess in my mind, if you meet any of the exceptions, you're accepted. The third one isn't intended to say if you don't meet exception 3, then you can't take advantage of exceptions 1 and 2. So is
Okay.
it just a problem with the wording?
The wording seems a little odd to me, but also not just that. In number 1, if I have just slightly over the 5,000, let's say my 6,000 square foot of conditioned space, you have to have a very large system in order to have the requirement for the battery storage system. So if I have a 6,000 square foot restaurant, then I can have a 900 kW system, which is big, very large, and still not require the energy storage system. So it goes to intent as well.
Well, yeah, so first thing, there could be some clarifications to indicate that if any one of these 3 exceptions is met, that there wouldn't be a battery storage requirement. Secondly, it looks like I did not retain some information that was for this equation A in exception 1 that would indicate how that works. I don't think it's, I mean, it's a 6,000 square foot restaurant. It's going to have, at least an order of magnitude smaller system. So the intent of the exception 1 is really to cover projects that have much smaller systems to the extent to where they're not there's no significant incremental benefit for having that storage system. So I may need to clarify that, and it might not be super efficient to try to do that on this call, unfortunately.
Is it
'Cause
possible that the I'm sorry, is it possible
Sorry,
the
go
number
ahead.
should have been 0.025 kWdc? Because that would make a lot more sense. Right now at 0.25, like I said, for 6,000, 5,000, 7,000, I can have a very large system exempt from the battery storage system.
Sorry, where you,
Exception 1.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I wonder if this is an order of magnitude issue. What I was
Right.
thinking is maybe that should be per 100 square feet of conditioned floor
Something.
area. That maybe could
Some-
solve that
Yeah, something's
factor.
not making sense.
So I think it's worth looking at that. And then to
Mhm.
solve the clarity issue, I think all we need to do is just put an or at the end of each of exceptions 1 and 2. So at the very end, we just put comma or, exception 2,
Yep.
comma or, and then any of those are applicable.
I think that would help to clarify it.
Within the I codes, exceptions where they're listed are considered like, mutually exclusive, might be the right way. So whenever you have a list of exceptions, if any of them apply, then it's accepted. So we have this throughout the I codes where you have a list of exceptions without the ors. If you put ors here, then that could actually create confusion elsewhere, where people then begin to think, well, wait, now does this list mean it's all of them? So so the convention is when there is a list, the or is implied, implicit. So I would just worry about creating some confusion in code enforcement generally by deviating from that convention.
And I can see where you're going with that. I do know that it's going to be confusing to the design community. When they see a conflict, they may or may not automatically think, oh, it's mutually exclusive. They're going to say, I see a conflict between 1 and 3, and this is a big cost. So they need to know when an energy storage system is required and when it's not.
Yeah,
So
I
I
mean, the
just-
other thing we can do at the end of 704.1.2, prior to the exceptions, we could just say probably something about, any of the following,
Yeah.
that kind of language as well. Because when the exceptions in the converse are intended, for example, you have to meet all of the exceptions, the charging language will say, and shall meet all of the following, and then it lists, whatever it lists of. So that sort of thing. We'll have to wordsmith it a tiny bit there, but generally speaking, it could work.
So, Carol, does this take care of your concerns? It sounds like, I mean, we definitely need to have the equation A in here. I think we can clarify that it's one
Does it-
of the exceptions.
Does equation A even apply if you have exception 1? Because if you look at 1 as it's written, no battery storage systems required if the installed PV system size is less than 0.25 kW DC capacity per square foot of conditioned floor area. I'm not even sure the equation even applies, because if you meet this exception, you don't need it. But it looks like everything's going to meet that exception for the most part, unless you have a huge system.
I'm not seeing the same thing on the screen. I'm sorry. I'm seeing less than.
Yeah.
System
Yeah,
size is
you
less
have
than
that.
15%.
What I have is when I clicked on from our meeting invite, I clicked on that, and what mine says is no battery storage is required. So maybe it's been changed since then. But it said no battery storage systems required if the installed PV system size is less than 0.25 kW DC capacity per square foot of conditioned floor area. So that's where I'm coming from. So it may have changed since that was
Yeah,
included.
That's true. The link from the agenda is different from what we see on the screen. Which
Okay.
one is more current? I think the
Oh,
one on
yeah,
the screen
so-
is the most current.
Okay.
Yeah, so that sounds like a bit of a snafu. If it's 0.25, it's probably watts per square foot and not kilowatts per square foot.
I
If it's
thought
a-
about that.
So,
Okay.
but in any case, I think this was clarified to reference some other minimum size requirement. In any case, it's apparent this exception 1 needs clarification.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification on the exception.
Are there any comments on if any if this is a good idea to include a battery storage requirement for Denver for the green code? I haven't heard any kind of existential comments against. These systems they're not cheap currently, but they are getting much cheaper over time. There's multiple manufacturers, even of the smaller systems. There's at least 3 or 4 major manufacturers beyond the Tesla Powerwall. And one other thing to note is that there's no over specification of how those systems will be controlled. There's the storage systems, especially the larger commercial ones, they have pretty sophisticated controls as far as how they leverage when to store energy, when to discharge it. They can leverage it on rate signals and other triggers. But the intent is not really to dictate how those systems are controlled, but to have those available as a resource.
Thanks, John. And I think to clarify too, this wouldn't necessarily be a requirement in the Denver Green Code. It seems like it would be an optional credit in the optional code.
I did want to bring one other thing up, and it's not a comment, or it's just a comment, that whenever we have battery storage systems installed, I know that the fire department takes a keen interest in this because the gallons of electrolytes. So I don't know if there's any input that they would want to provide to this proposal or not, but I just want to bring that up, that they are very heavily involved with battery storage systems once they are over a certain, I think it's 50 gallons of electrolytes. So they may or may not have something to say about it.
Yeah, there have been some concerns from potential users of these and wanting to keep them at a certain distance away from the structure, just for extra protection. I think it is worth engaging with the fire code elements to make sure there aren't any concerns.
Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that. So in 2021, the fire code has quite extensively updated the requirements for battery storage systems in buildings. There's been a couple of fires that have kind of run away with battery storage systems, so the requirements have gotten more restrictive. It doesn't mean they're not allowed. There's just going to be more requirements when installing these battery storage systems within buildings. So I think acknowledging that it's not just the cost of the batteries, but there is some additional costs with the actual structure and ventilation requirements, et cetera, that are going to be required in Chapter 12 of the International Fire Code when requiring these systems should be acknowledged. And then the only other slight comment I have, and this is definitely outside my lane, is it just talks about where the IECC section to have a PV system. Is this intended for just the on-site PV system, or I would assume it would just be sized for the on-site PV system, but I know there's allowances as discussed in previous proposals for the off-site systems.
Yeah, so with the second question, yeah, so this intent was that this requirement for battery storage within the Denver Green Code would be triggered when you have a on-site PV system. So if you're using a PV resource off-site, at least the it was not intended to be required.
Gonna add language to clarify that here, if that works. I do want to be mindful of time as well. There are quite a few clarifications to work through here. I guess similar to the last proposal we spoke about, does the group agree to move this forward with the intent to clarify and confirm several of the things we talked about, clarifications to exceptions, looking at the number in exception 1, the fire concern. Let me see my other notes. But does the group agree to move it forward if those concerns are addressed, or how are we feeling here? See a head nod from Carol.
Generally, yes. I mean, I think it
Okay.
is appropriate to push the boundary in the green
Oh.
code.
I did have one question. C405.13, is that the base code? I'm trying to find it here, or is it another proposal? I just thought of something. Because it's not in the base code of the IECC. So I'm assuming it's a proposal that's coming up for a vote. Is that correct?
That was the mandatory minimum renewables requirement that ended up getting put into C406. So
it was approved or because I've been gone for a couple of weeks.
It wasn't approved as mandatory. So yeah, that section doesn't exist.
Okay, if that section doesn't exist, but yet it's still in this proposal, should that be modified or language changed? Because
yes,
it won't be required because it doesn't exist.
You would want to make a reference to where renewable energy systems are used to comply with, and then you list the places where you can use on-site renewable energy to comply with the code. So there's one in high input water heating. There's one in C406. There might be others, but those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
So would language need to be changed here? All buildings that are required by IECC section C4, excuse me, C405.13, wouldn't that code section need to go away or be changed since it wasn't approved? It's written.
You would need the language would need to be changed more substantially. It would need to be
right.
What
like
buildings include on-site renewable energy systems to comply with these sections.
I thought I should bring that up though, just so it could be changed before going to committee.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we would have to reference where, as Sean said, where these PVs being used to comply.
Okay. Think Carol, that was a great catch there. So I'll just ask, just again, does anyone object to moving this forward with the modifications that John will make and clarifications? Okay. Well, thank you all for that conversation. Let's move on to, let me pull it up. Where are we? 128. I'm going to pass this off to Kristen.
Hi, everyone. So this proposal 128 is about systems commissioning and functional testing for residential projects. The intent here is to make this mandatory, although I know that that is still in discussion with CCD. So there are some general requirements here if you want to scroll down, Courtney. So we've got some general provisions here, information on O&M that would be translated to the homeowner. There are requirements here for mechanical systems as well as lighting systems. And it is outlined kind of what the process is for those. It's a pretty comprehensive commissioning proposal, including a commissioning plan, testing and balancing, functional performance testing, and a final commissioning report that would be due at the end of the project prior to TCO, or at least there is some documentation that's required prior to TCO that goes to the building official. You can scroll down a little bit further too. So overall, the requirement here is that there is a registered design professional or a commissioning agent that is doing this work. And one of the reasons that this proposal is here is because there's a lot of, I guess, research and context about residential HVAC not performing optimally as intended. And so without the commissioning process, we're leaving that up to the installers to provide that goes in correctly, the systems get in correctly, and that they're working appropriately before the homeowner moves in. So I think that's a pretty decent overview. I'd like to open it up to questions. It would say that there's no threshold in terms of how this is applied. So it would be applied to single family residences. There's no minimum that has been outlined here.
So Kristen, when you make the statement about no minimum, I want to understand if this would also apply to additions or alterations. So if someone has an existing 2-story home and they, 2,000 square feet, they come in and they add a 400 square foot conditioned space, the entire building would be commissioned under these regulations. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, I don't know, what the likelihood of a project like that going through this process is, but potentially, yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, I mean, in the direction of pushing improvements and using green code as a preview, I'm in favor of this language. I guess we'll see if it ever gets chosen, but it is good language to look at, just higher performing buildings.
I have a question. If you have an older home where they plan to have an addition, and the addition, you're saying now that the entire home has to meet this proposal. So that means they've got to go back. I just want to make sure I understand. They go back to the original home and they'll have to go in and replace all the lighting controls with controls where required by 402.2. Is that correct? And that would apply also to the exterior as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think that they'd have to go back and do, I mean, the lighting controls, right? If you're adding new lighting in that space, I would say that yes, that would need to be commissioned because that would be new. I think for mechanical systems, right, if you're tying into existing systems, ductwork, things like that, I don't know how much you could isolate that. I think it would probably make sense in the efficiency of the entire system to commission the entire thing.
I was just wondering because the language here does not specifically state that. Because if the whole home now the existing building and the new portion of the building has to be commissioned, how will they know not to go through with commissioning of the existing building and installing all the lighting controls for exterior and interior?
I think there should be some clarifying language here. I mean, I think additions and alterations are kind of a little bit gray, right? In terms of how this applies. I don't think that, if you're commissioning just the section that you're adding on or that you're altering, right? It does have ramifications for the rest of the building if the systems are tied in. Lighting, I feel like, is one of those things, right, where you can kind of section things off.
Mm-hmm.
I would advocate for some clarifying language around some of these things in terms of scope.
That makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
It could be as simple as new systems installed in buildings. And that covers new buildings and new systems and additions and new systems and alterations.
Yeah, that's great.
And Sean, would that be in the 402.1 section? This section covers provisions of maintenance.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, that's where I would put it too.
Chris, I'm gonna put this language in here and then I think we can clean that up. This isn't the best.
I think you can just put new residential mechanical and lighting systems. Just insert the word new.
Okay.
Agreed.
Okay.
So one other point of cleanup, if you look under 402.2.3. So it references section 402.2.3.1 through C408. And so that C408 is the commercial commissioning section out of the base code. And so I think the intent was to, list the sections that are here. So whatever the final section is of this would be the.
Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Does anyone object to moving this proposal forward for the Denver Green Code? Or want further discussions? Okay. Thank you all. We will move to 126 and try to get this as much as we can wrapped up today. Thank you.
Awesome. So, excuse me. So 126 is kind of in the same vein. This is for commercial projects. And we are expanding the language for functional performance testing, as well as commissioning. And so in the first paragraph right there, if you can stop, you'll see that there is a threshold for projects not greater than 10,000 square feet will comply with the functional performance testing requirements. And then larger buildings will also do functional performance testing as well as commissioning requirements. And so this language is directly from the 2021 IGCC with some adaptions for Denver. It includes all of HVAC and refrigeration, lighting, domestic hot water, and then any type of water pumping and irrigation as well. And then for the larger systems, it also includes the commissioning of any renewables and energy storage systems, building management systems, etc. So really this language has come directly from IGCC. And so you'll have all of the functional performance test requirements, all the activities. There are some, there will probably be a supplemental policy here to outline some requirements for the experience and testing equipment. I think that was a discussion when we had put this together, is that, how do you get someone with the appropriate credentials? And so that should be addressed in a different policy, but not codified. So that's the intent here, is really that, you'll have O&M documentation, you'll have a commissioning plan, you'll have a design review report, a preliminary commissioning report, and a final commissioning report. This includes, for larger buildings, looking at the OPR and the BOD as part of the design review, and then lesser requirements just for functional performance testing of all the systems for smaller buildings. So now there's a lot to cover here, but this really kind of mimics existing code language that's already in existence. There are some, I guess, some sections in here that remain unchanged, like the acoustical control. And I think that's the only one. So So the intent here is really to kind of widen kind of our, you know, our look into commissioning and the commissioning process for these projects. And with that, I think it's a good summary. I'm definitely open to questions and comments.
So on a new building that's being constructed, complying with the Denver Green Code, these commissioning requirements are slightly different than the commissioning requirements in based IECC. Is the intent that they would follow just the Denver Green Code commissioning requirements? Has the two different commissioning requirements between the IECC and Denver Green Code been reconciled? Like, what's the compliance path we would have to, what are we asking for at the end of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that those have been rectified and compared. That's probably something that needs to happen. I think this was, you know, put together a while ago, and so that's definitely a step I think that needs to happen. I would assume that we would want them to follow these if they were going after the DGC as written. But we want to make sure that these are a step up from what's already in the IECC.
Yeah, I think the biggest, I mean, the Denver Green Code is based on an ASHRAE, or is created based on the coordination with ASHRAE Green Code standard. Was it 183? Or 189? Yeah, 189. And so some of the references are back to ASHRAE and ASHRAE requirements. And so I don't know if one's better or worse, it's just different. And that's the challenge I see, is we probably should identify which way we want the design team to commission their project.
Got it. Yeah, that's a fundamental difference. I would assume that we should probably stick with IECC since that's in the base code. So this language would need to mirror that. So I see, yes, there are several references to ASHRAE standards, and those would need to be revised. I assume that's the direction that CCD would want to go.
I think for overall compliance at the end, especially as design teams are familiar with commissioning here in Denver, having one commissioning path would be best.
Yes, completely agree. Let's try not to make this more complicated than it actually is. Okay, well, that will need to be done offline, definitely, to update those, make sure that they're consistent.
I have a question.
Sure.
In 1001.3.1.1, B, 0.1.1B, where it says lighting systems over 5 kW in total capacity, is the intent to include both the internal and external lighting, or just the internal lighting? Because I can see that question coming to my team.
Yes, I think the intent there, and I'll have to double check this with what the IEC references, but I think that's only internal lighting.
If that's the case, can the language at least be modified to clearly say that? Because I can see it as being confusing otherwise.
Yes.
Kristen, do you have that note? I'm sorry, Carol, I missed the section that you stated.
Yeah, you're right there, B, the lighting systems, right at the top
Right
of
there.
this, top of the page.
Oh, okay.
Interior lighting systems.
Thank you. We do have like 5 minutes left. Do we, as a group, agree to move this forward with the understanding that Kristen will update the ASHRAE language to reference IECC instead? Or I should always ask the negative side. Does anyone disagree with moving that forward? Thank you. Okay. David Carlson, thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry we only gave you 5 minutes, but hopefully we can get through some of these.
Well, the first one is just a housekeeping one. In the lighting for plant growth, there's a reference to require UL listing or nationally recognized testing laboratory listing of luminaires for plant growth. Well, in an energy conservation code, you shouldn't really be referencing a safety item. Those are covered in the respective building codes. I do know the NEC has an article or a paragraph regarding requiring listing of equipment. So I think it should be deleted from here.
I agree with David on this.
Yeah, I do too. I think that's a pretty easy one.
Okay, thank you, David. Does anyone disagree with moving this proposal forward? All right, thank you for that efficiency. Let's move to P7.
Okay, the next one regards provisions for interconnection to PV systems and to energy storage systems. The language in the proposal is written so that interconnection can only happen in the main panel opposite the main device in the panel. Well, the National Electrical Code addresses the issue of interconnection of PV systems and energy storage systems that allows for other provisions besides that one. And I think we should follow what the NEC, the National Electrical Code, allows for how systems are interconnected.
I think David has a very valid point on intent, because the way that it was currently written, it is very restrictive, where if it follows the NEC language and the language that David has added, it gives them more flexibility on whether interconnections shall be at. Instead of just the main electrical service panel, it could be at another panel that may be more convenient for the system.
A lot of times they want to connect on the supply side of the main service breaker or overcurrent device, which this would preclude the way it's written right now.
I do have a question for Sean, though. Sean, I don't know if you're still on or not. I'm assuming you are. I just don't see you on here. My question is, good, thanks. It's more of a code language question. Where David's referencing 705.11 or 705.12, can we do that? Or can we not reference another code section that potentially the reference numbers could change? For instance, 705.11 is a new code section in the 2020 NEC. 705.12 is not. There's always the possibility that 705.11 or 12 could change in next year's code. I have not seen next year's code or sometime in the future until such time that we go through this whole process again. So is it adequate to reference the NEC specific code sections, or do we reference article related to supply side and load side source connections? What's most appropriate?
So it's usually best to not reference specific sections from another code, especially ones that are being updated in the same process and we're not going to change. Generally, I think you would just say the reserved spaces shall be located in accordance with the National Electric Code. Or actually, Denver has a specific name, a Denver version of the electric code. So that's what you would refer to. So shall be located in accordance with is it the Denver Electrical Code? I don't know.
We don't have a Denver Electric code. We're
It is, so
under
it
the
is just-
NEC.
It
It's
is
under the
just,
NEC.
okay,
I
so then
think-
National Electric Code.
Would that be
covers,
appropriate?
however, the electrical code decides to regulate location.
Okay, I think that's where the point was, is David was making a point of saying you could have either a supply side connection or load side connection.
Mhm.
And I think he was just trying to point that out. So I didn't know if we needed to add that sort of language, allow for compliance with, I could barely see this, with the requirements of the National Electrical Code article related to supply side and load side source connections, or do what you're saying is just shall comply with the NEC. But I did think that we ought to not reference specific code sections.
Yeah,
I mean,
think-
the only other thing I would say is if you feel very confident that's going to stay in section 705 and we just don't know what subsection, we
See where
could
you're
be
going.
a little more general there, but there is still the risk. So if we think it could actually move out of 705, then yeah, just NEC.
It's unlikely. It's unlikely to move out of 705.
So that could work, and then you can easily, by practice, apply point 11 and point 12 if that's the right subsection.
Okay.
Really, all of this is redundant because the
It is.
energy code has a reference to the NEC, a blanket reference to the electrical code. This is really just a reminder for usability. It's not necessary for implementing the requirements.
I agree with you. I do think it sometimes is good to give people, I guess, a helping hand, even though it's redundant, so that they can understand the code section in case they don't go to another code section to understand it.
So I do have the 705 reference. That's where I feel like we landed. Correct me if I'm wrong in there. And for the sake of time, we're 2 minutes over. I know most of us have to jump. Does everyone agree to move this, or does anyone disagree to move this proposal forward? Taking that as a no. So thank you all. Mike, we will touch base with you, or he had a jump as well, but the ones we didn't get to, we can touch base on with the proponents. Thank you all again. Appreciate all the extra time you've given the city to help us move these proposals. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.